Tell us quickly, like, how you met your wife. You met her when you were 7 or 8 or
in grade 3.
In grade 3?
Yeah.
And did you fall in love with her
in grade 3?
In grade 3?
Yeah.
And was it mutual? Not in the beginning.
She wouldn't admit it if it was. There were lots of the boys in grade 3 were in love with her. She had a whole little crew of guys that were perfectly willing to follow her around, and she was perfectly willing to exploit that. She was very good at it. Yeah, she was very popular.
It's
little
just
girl.
so wonderful that you met as children.
Yeah, we were friends for a long time. We used to play chess together and croquet, and she was a vicious croquet player. She would, I don't know if you've ever played croquet, but if your balls touch, then you can stand on yours and whack it, and then the other person's ball will vanish off into the stratosphere, and she liked to knock it all the way down the street.
Mean.
Yeah,
so
and then
mean.
she'd laugh, and so she always had a good vicious sense of humor. It's one of the things I actually admire about my wife when we've had our verbal disputes, which have certainly happened. She can string together a sequence of insults that's so hair-raising that you have to laugh. It's like,
did she have brothers?
She did. She has a brother, much older, 8 years older. But he's quite a peaceful person, and she had 2 sisters.
I just find girls with brothers can get along with guys, because guys, they show love and affection by insults and jabs and jeers and I had a brother, and I sort of learned but if you don't have brothers, girls are like, oh, that's so rude, that's so So she was
she has a naturally
or maybe she came by it naturally.
Acerbic twist. She did well, and her father is quite sharp-witted and he was a real town character. He's still alive. He was a real character in the town, a real hyper extrovert. Everybody knew him, and he had a pretty good wit on him, and she had some of that. Well, it still does have some of that. So she was
aside from her acerbic humor and her ability to whack balls, and I just don't want to go further on that description. That could have many things that tells us about you. But what else attracted? I mean, you've known her pretty much your whole life. So some of the other qualities that not just attracted you, but enable you to sustain. I mean, I think every young person in this room will want to know, and maybe there isn't one, but what's the secret? What's it like to be with someone that long? How do you sustain that?
Well, I think if you're fortunate, some of it's good fortune. And I would say this is true. I've watched people in their relationships, personally for a long time, but also as a professional, because I've done a lot of clinical counseling. And I mean, there's some things that need to be a given about the relationship, I would say. It doesn't hurt to find the other person very attractive. Mm-hmm. And that's a mysterious thing. We're not exactly sure what it is that produces, let's say, chemistry between people, although chemistry is definitely part of what produces it. There's subtle things that attract people to one another that are way below the level of consciousness. So, for example, women don't like the odor of men who have Rh blood factors, who, if they had children with, would be likely to produce a stillborn infant.
Well, that's definitely a category on Match.com. Like
right. Well, it's so strange though, because how
do you even know?
Well, that's a good question, and you know by odor apparently, and so there's
what if you're wearing cologne?
Well, then it would depend on what type of cologne it is. But
RH, what was it?
Right. Smell is a very strange sense, and it's very deeply tied to very profound emotions, including memory. And so you find people attractive for reasons that you can't always determine. And so that was part of it. I mean, I've always found her very attractive, and that continues. And I liked her combativeness, like I think that you want someone, I think, in a relationship that you can spar with. And it's partly because you have hard problems to solve. And if the person that you're with isn't willing to put forward their opinion, then you only have half the cognitive power that you would otherwise have. And hopefully you find someone who's interestingly different from you, like not so different that you can't communicate, and you have to be careful of that, but interestingly different, and then hopefully they have the ability and the will to express their opinion, and then it's, then your interest stays heightened, and there has to be that tension in a relationship. People think, well, I want to get along perfectly with my partner. It's like, no, you probably don't. You just get bored, and then you go looking for trouble. And so you want a little bit of trouble in the relationship, and a little bit of mystery, and a little bit of combativeness, and the ability to exchange opinions forthrightly. And I trust her, which is a huge element. I mean, when we finally did decide to get together permanently, we were both in our later 20s. And, one of the things that I had learned by that point and insisted to her about was that we had to tell each other the truth. And she took to that wholeheartedly, and for better and for worse, because truths can be harsh.
Does that include, does this outfit make me look like that?
Yeah, well, the truthful answer to that is I don't answer questions that are likely to get me in trouble. Yeah, so...
I have a son who will answer honestly, and it's infuriating, but then I realized if you want the truth, talk to Tamara. I'll tell you.
Well, that's the thing, it's useful to know.
The truth is empowering. Truth tellers are charismatic, and actually both my sons are brutally honest, which is disconcerting.
Yeah.
But I can see that it's made them very formidable, and because of people trust them and the friendships, and just it gives them and you've written a lot about this.
Well, if I tell my wife that she looks good in an outfit, she knows that I mean it.
Yeah.
And so there's some utility in that.
And then if you're silent and say, I don't answer questions, that she goes and changes
it.
it.
Well, sometimes, she'll say, do you like this? And I'll tell her that I don't. And that doesn't necessarily make her happy in the moment.
Right.
But if I do say I like it, she knows that I mean it. And, I actually like her sense of style a lot. So it turns out that 90% of the time it's pretty easy for me to say, look, I think you look great, and mean it. Mm-hmm. And, she's a fairly harsh standard bearer too. She's insisted that I stay in whatever reasonable physical shape I happen to be in. That was something that she's very demanding of. And I would say that it's the same from my side. And we've been good at negotiating, which is, what do you want from a partner fundamentally? What do you want and need? I mean, the first thing is that, well, hopefully, like I said, you're blessed with the fact that you find each other attractive. And I think it's very difficult for the relationship to begin or proceed or sustain itself without that. But having that, then what do you want? Well, you want someone that you can trust. You want someone that you can build a view of the future with. And you want someone that you can negotiate with. And that's very hard to negotiate with people because they have to tell you what they think. They have to know what they want or figure it out. They have to tell you what they want. They have to be satisfied when they get what they want, which is also a very difficult thing to manage. And you have to continually update that because your life goes through different stages. And
your attraction wanes, as we all know at our stage of life, not fatally necessarily.
Speak for yourself.
but you will go. I mean, you will not be 25 forever. So that has to be renegotiated.
Yeah, well, and you have to work at that too,
right.
And that's something that people also don't understand because they tend to think that, well, that all romantic interaction should be spontaneous. It's like, well, if that's your theory, then you might as well just give up right now if you're going to get married because the only reason you can think that is because you don't have enough responsibility to make romantic entanglement virtually impossible. And what happens when you're married, especially when you have little kids, is that, and you both have a job, let's say, is you're so busy that the probability that you're going to find time for spontaneous mutual interaction decreases to zero. And so if that's what you're hoping for, then you're never going to have it. And so what you have to do is you have to make time for each other. And, if you're dating, when you're establishing a relationship, well, you put some effort into it. You decide that you're going to go out for dinner and you dress up to some degree and, you try to present yourself to each other in some halfway mutually acceptable manner. And you hope that there's going to be a positive consequence of that you're going to find each other attractive. But then people somehow think that once they're married that the same amount of effort isn't necessary, and that's wrong. I would say more effort is necessary on the same front. And you have to think it through. It's like, if you don't want to be bitter about the intimate element of your relationship, how much time do you have to spend together each week? And my rule of thumb, sort of derived from clinical observations, is that you need to spend 90 minutes a week with your partner talking. And that means you're telling each other about your life and staying in touch, so that you each know what the other is up to. And you're discussing what needs to be done to keep the household running smoothly. And you're laying out some mutually acceptable vision of how the next week or the next months are going to go together, right? So that keeps your narratives locked together like the strands in a rope. You need that for 90 minutes or you drift apart. And you need to spend intimate time together at least once a week, and probably more like twice. And that has to be negotiated. And if you don't negotiate it, and if you don't make it a priority, then it won't happen in all likelihood. And then, well, then you don't have it. And that's a catastrophe, because there's not that many things in life that are, intrinsically, what would you say, engaging and meaningful and pleasurable and also bonding, all of that. And if you let that go, then, well, part of you dies and part of the relationship dies, and then there's always the possibility of becoming attracted by alternative entanglements, which you would do if you had any spirit left, right? I mean, that's the thing, is if your relationship at home is entirely unsatisfying sexually, what are you supposed to do with that? Nothing? Are you supposed to just bear it? I mean, in one way the answer is yes, because it's your marriage, but another way is, well, what, that's all the fight you've got in you? You're going to just let the erotic element of your life die and accept everything that goes along with that because you're not willing to cause a bit of trouble to ensure that it's maintained? And, and we're not very good at thinking these things through consciously. And people are bad at negotiating, period, as far as I can tell. But they're particularly bad at negotiating things that are deeply private. How much do you want your partner to know about you anyways? It takes a lot of trust to have a real conversation about what you need and want.
Now, you have, in the press, people read that you have a following of young men. And I went to hear your lecture in Washington, D.C., and there were a lot of women there. And your book, first of all, men don't buy books that often compared to women, so I'm presuming you have a lot of female readers. And I found it, Danielle and I found it completely readable and...
Well, it wasn't written for men.
No, it was. So you have
it's more like a delusional desire on the part of the radical leftists that the only people that could possibly be attracted to me are angry men.
Exactly.
And it'd be better if they were angry young white men, because
right.
Then that fits the narrative
particularly. But you have a diverse audience, a diverse following, including many women. And
they're also not particularly angry. I mean, I've talked to 200...
You're diffusing the anger. That's the point of your book, is stop being angry, stop being resentful, right?
Well, resentment is that's absolutely crippling.
Right.
Resentment, deceit, arrogance. That's part of, I'm writing another book, and one of the rules is don't allow yourself to become
what is resentful, it again? Resentful,
deceitful, and arrogant. Yeah,
RDA.
those three things together.
Yeah.
But it could be rad if you just...
Right. Well, that's supposed to be a good thing. So, yeah, and there's been 250,000 people, as I said, come to the lectures, and there hasn't been a single negative incident, not one.
This is what I find fascinating, is that I found you early on. I had no idea you were. I just thought, it was like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, like, who is that guy? Who is that guy? Like, you were pretty good. And we were covering a lot of the same topics later on, and wow. And then, I found out who you were. What is astonishing to me is that there's this amazing just split between the positivity of your audience, the diversity of your audience, the intellectual content of your message, and then you get with a snarky journalist with an agenda. And I'm not mentioning names, but this...
BBC.
This young woman from GQ.
Oh, yeah.
And it
she
was
hated
just...
me on site.
On site.
So
And it was
did
just
the
like,
BBC lady.
gotcha.
That was Channel 4. We don't want to blame the BBC.
True.
It was Channel 4.
You were a saint. And then and she seemed, like as often, she seemed intelligent and capable of insight up to a point. But it's almost as if something had seized her mind, and she...
Oh, yes, something had.
Something
That's
had.
for sure, you bet.
I think people... and
Possessed by ideology.
Camille Paglia says that a whole generation of some of our most talented young women are incapable of thought because of this ideology.
Or different thought, maybe you mean.
Or just an openness to... She couldn't... And you were saying completely, like, interesting, fascinating, original things, even to me who've studied these topics. And I thought, wow. And
no, it was quite the day. So I went to Baltimore.
You survived it
very
well
and
acquitted yourself
made me think a lot that day, because I went there and I had to go out of my way to do it. Not that I'm complaining, but there's a reason for saying that. You know, so I got
you had to
there.
go to Baltimore?
Yeah, well, I was talking in Baltimore.
Oh, okay.
So
there's the aquarium.
And I showed up to the hotel room where this was all occurring. And, you know, what you expect, generally speaking, even from journalists who aren't, you know, who are more of the attack dog variety, or who maybe aren't positively predisposed to you ideologically or personally, you expect a certain modicum of professional politeness.
Right.
You know, because, well, you don't have to be there, and you came, and you accepted an invitation and all of that. And so even with the Channel 4 journalist, Kathy Newman, she was quite polite and forthcoming in the green room before the interview,
right.
You know. So she would have had at least that professional persona, right. Which is, it's not nothing, right? There's something to be said for going through the motions professionally in an appropriate manner. But when I walked into the hotel room in Baltimore, it was obvious that this interviewer had already made up her mind about me 100%, and that she was absolutely, you know, negatively predisposed to me with a personal animus. And animus is exactly the right word. And there was about a half an hour photography session because it was GQ. And so I was in that atmosphere. The photographers were fine. I was in that atmosphere for about 45 minutes before we started to talk. And part of the reason that I'm so, I'm not as calm during that interview as I usually am. I'm a little bit harsher. And the reason for that is that, you know, it just started off instantly combative. And what I should have done, you see, it's very, very difficult to be awake enough to do these things properly. And the interview progressed fine, although by the end of it, I thought that I had maybe done enough interviews for a while, because I didn't think I had regulated my temper as well during that interview as I might have. I was
You actually
harsher.
did.
Well,
for the first
few
minutes, you were getting angry, and then she brought up a question about anger, and I just saw you kind of adjust, and then after that, it was smooth sailing.
Well, that's good, because it was touch and go, you know, and I thought, boy, you know, maybe you're running out of patience. Maybe maybe it's time to dial back on the interviews, because, you know, I've had many interviews like that, and I find them, like, and it takes me like 3 days to recover from an interview.
And then
that.
you start thinking to yourself, like, what I should have said. I should have said that, and I drive myself mad. No, but you did very well. But it's so interesting that what it told me was how parochial she was, and she lives in her own little world.
But Christina, isn't it more a little bit about the ideology of our time? And gosh, you encounter this everywhere. And when I used to write about this, wisely, I would encounter it. I mean, I think part of the issue is that you will acknowledge that there are differences between the sexes. That seems to be
I know, that's a hell of a
the
sexist
heresy.
thing to do.
No, that's a heresy. Because when I was reading your book, there's nothing about it that is anti-female. In fact, you do a lot of examination of the Adam and Eve story, and you have this wonderful passage about, like, Adam being the originally aggrieved man who throws the woman under the bus. You know, and
he's the original.
It's her fault.
Like,
it's her fault. I'm God. You too. You made her. It's your fault too. That I'm hiding. It's really funny.
So there's nothing in this, and the rules, such as they are, you know, they seem very commonsensical. They could apply to anyone. So is that a fair surmise of why you get so attacked? That just the very fact that you're willing to speak about the sexes as being not unequal, but
different but equal.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I would say that that's part of it, because there's a threat there. So one of the things that happened when I was in Scandinavia, I just wrote a column about this, actually. It was interesting being in Scandinavia, especially in Sweden, because they've pushed the equality of opportunity doctrine farther than any other country in the world.
They invented it. It all started there, like in the UN, in the original, the charter. The Swedes were there. They've never given up.
No. And the week that I was there was the same week that 2 articles were published on gender differences in temperament and in interest. And the biggest sex differences that we know of that aren't morphological are in interest. So women are more interested in people, by and large, and men are more interested in things, by and large. And the difference is actually large. It's 1 standard deviation. And so that means if you're a man, you would have to be more interested in people than 85% of men to be as interested as 50% of women. And if you're a woman, you'd have to be more interested in things than 85% of women to be as interested as the 50th percentile male. So the difference is actually quite substantial. And it's certainly large enough to drive occupational choice differences,
and
which it does.
Explains a lot about the configuration of people in the workplace.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and we're approaching parity in terms of overall workplace distribution of men and women, but there's massive differences in occupational choice. Like, it's very interesting, for example, to go to the website of the U.S. Labor Department and look at male and female-dominated industries. And, there's the top 10 male-dominated industries have basically 0 women in them. So bricklayers being one of them.
They're people-free zones, according to Camille Paglia, that you find just a lot of men in the people-free zones.
Yeah.
And the women you ask a group of women and men, would you rather spend the next 3 weeks taking apart a machine and putting it together, or helping a group of people work out their problems? And the pool of people who want to do the machine, it's just far more men than women.
Well, and there's more men in women-dominated industries than there are women in men-dominated industries at the extreme. So that's kind of interesting.
Would that be like nursing?
Nursing, yeah.
Yeah,
so there's way more male nurses than there are female bricklayers.
I've studied these male nurses, and they already, gender activists are upset because they earn more than women. And a professor of nursing at University of Pennsylvania tried to find out why. And she found out they immediately find out what's the best paying field, subfield. So they go into like nurse anesthesiology. It pays a lot more. The men are there in disproportionate number. And they're willing to work insane hours. They're far more willing to move to a higher
Same
paying
thing Farrell
field.
found with gender differences, is that men are more willing to move.
They're
more willing to work longer hours. Yeah, they're more willing to work outside. They're more willing to take on dangerous tasks. They're more likely to work in scalable industries. So, you can't scale personal care. It's really very, very difficult. They're much less likely to work part-time. If they have small businesses, they're much more likely to work full-time in the small business rather than part-time.
Yeah.
And, women have their reasons to want to work part-time. And Farrell also pointed out that if you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. Non-linear return on overtime. That's something that's really useful to know,
It's
in terms of your career
beneficial
planning.
to an employer that have someone.
Well, it also marks you out. Like if you have 10 employees and they're all doing a reasonable job, let's say, but one of them is working an extra half an hour a day or 45 minutes a day, and you can observe that every day, then that gives them an edge with regards to potential promotion. And the return on those edges is nonlinear. And so, anyway, so I went to Scandinavia, and it was the same week that 2 studies were released showing what had already been established beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the personality differences between men and women, and the differences in interest as well, actually get bigger as your society gets richer and as it gets more egalitarian. And not just a little bit either. That's the other thing that's so interesting, is you might think, well, the effect is, it's the opposite of what the social constructionists would predict, first of all. So that's the first thing to point out, is it's not only that their hypothesis wasn't supported, it was decidedly refuted. And none of them have come to terms with that. And it's not a small effect. The difference between personality between men and women in Scandinavia is a lot larger than it is in non-egalitarian countries.
Like in rural Botswana.
But that's also true in the United States. The richer the demographic your household, the more likely the woman is to take time out and be at home with the kids.
Right.
Because she can afford to do it.
She can afford to do it, and she can afford to major in odd, low-paying fields like I don't know, feminist dance therapy or something.
Well, the other thing you see too is that one of the things that's also interesting, I think, is that there's this idea that marriage is a patriarchal institution, that's primarily put there for the utility of the male, and think, well, I think that's complete bloody rubbish, and I don't think there's any evidence to support it at all. But I think the best counter evidence is that, well, if that's the case, then rich people shouldn't be getting married because they don't have to oppress themselves. But the truth of the matter is that the higher your demographic position, the more likely you are to be married. So marriage has fallen apart among,
And the more likely the wife is staying home, but not, she has all sorts of pursuits, but she's not.
Well, there's an old saying, any woman who marries for money earns it.
Yeah.
But now let me this is where you might get in a little trouble. Because in your book you call men order and women chaos. And you say, order, the known, appears symbolically associated with masculinity, and chaos, the eternal feminine, is also the crushing force of sexual selection.
Yeah, what's up with that?
Yeah, we chaotic.
Okay.
You find us chaotic.
It isn't men and women that are order and chaos. It's masculinity and femininity symbolically. And so what's happened fundamentally is that our brains are wired for social cognition. So we're not natural scientists. We're natural sociologists. That might be a better, even though I shudder to think that might be true.
Especially given the state of sociology.
Yes, well, that's it.
Okay, triggering.
Or maybe,
triggering.
Yeah, or maybe we're more naturally people who observe through the lens of fiction, and that what we see is the world as characterized. And the world, obviously, is made out of men and women and children, and those seem to be our fundamental cognitive categories: masculinity, femininity, and then the category of children. And those categories have expanded to take on connotations outside of pure person perception. And so, it's for this reason that if you go to a movie, and maybe it's a Disney animated movie, and I like to talk about those because they draw on a very deep symbolic well, it's perfectly reasonable to see a witch that lives in a swamp, because those go together. Like, it makes sense. The witch doesn't live in a gleaming chrome high-rise. No. She lives in a swamp because that's, and maybe in a shack.
Handy for her broom, I think. She could just fly out.
Well,
the
that's
door.
it. Well, the high-rise would be better for the broom, right? Because you could take off. You could take off better. But there are categories of symbolic association that are natural to the way we think, and the fundamental elements of those categories seem to be gendered. And so this is partly why I make reference to Taoism, for example. So for the Taoists, the world is made out of chaos and order. And chaos is the domain that you don't understand and that emerges unpredictably, but also the domain from which new forms emerge, right? Because it's from novelty that the new emerges. And I think the fundamental association between femininity and chaos is the association between what's unexpected and novel and what's new, because new forms emerge from chaos. And it's not that chaos is bad and order is good. That's not.
Both have their pathologies.
Both have their pathologies.
And their virtue. Yeah,
yes, and what you're looking for, and this is what the book concentrates on above all, is that you're looking constantly to find the balance between those two. So, for example, formally speaking, the domain of order is that place that you are when what you're doing is producing the results that you want to have produced. So imagine, think about the preconditions for not being anxious. Okay, so the preconditions are that you're constantly making predictions about what's going to happen next. And those predictions are tied tightly to your behavioral output. So you act in a certain way and you presume that a certain thing is going to happen. And if your actions produce the results that you desire, then you assume that you know where you are and you know what you're doing, and that your plan is intact, and that the environment is secure, and that keeps your anxiety under control. That's order. And then, maybe you're at a party and you don't know anybody, and you tell a joke and everybody looks at you like what you said was not only not funny, but also downright offensive. And then all of a sudden, you've moved from the domain of order into the domain of chaos, because you thought you were somewhere, and you thought you were someone, and you thought you were with people that were of a certain type, and you got all that wrong. And so it calls...
You're also suggesting it is going to be the woman who says, I find that really offensive.
I'm not suggesting that.
But it probably is. Never mind.
But women are also more sensitive to negative emotion.
Right.
So there is some slightly higher probability that that might be the case. But then I think women are also associated, at least in men's imaginations, with nature, which is part of the chaotic domain, say, as opposed to culture, because they're sexually selective. So you got to think, what is nature? I mean, we have that as a cognitive category, right? We think of the natural world, we think of nature versus culture. It's a fundamental opposition. What is nature? Well, nature is trees and landscapes and animals and all of that. But that isn't what nature fundamentally is. Nature fundamentally is that which selects from a genetic perspective. That's nature. That's the fundamental definition of nature. And it is the case that human females are sexually selective. And it's a major component of human behavior. So the evolutionary theory, roughly speaking, is that the reason we diverged from chimpanzees 8 million years ago, 7 million years ago, is at least in part because of the differences between sexual selectivity between female humans and female chimpanzees. Female chimpanzees are more likely to have offspring from dominant males, but it's not because of their sexual selectivity. So a female chimpanzee has periods of fertility that are marked by by observable physiological changes. Not the case with human females. Human female ovulation is concealed. So that's a very profound biological difference between human females and chimpanzees. And the chimpanzee females will mate with any male, but the dominant males chase the subordinate males away. But human females are sexually selective, and it's not a trivial fact. So you have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. You think, well, how can that be? Well, imagine that on average, every single human female has had one child throughout the entire course of history, which is approximately correct, by the way. Then imagine that half of the men had 0 and the other half had 2. Okay, and that's roughly the case. So half of males, historically speaking, have been reproductive disasters. And the reason for that is because of female sexual selectivity. So it is actually the case that female humans are nature. It's not only that they're associated with nature symbolically. As far as reproduction is concerned, they are the force of nature that does the selection. And so they're nature in the most fundamental way. And there is a chaotic element of that, at least in relationship to men, and also in relationship to women, because a lot of the female-on-female competition is competition that's chaotic for the right to be sexually selective, right? Not only with regards to men, which drives a lot of politicking, but also in relationship to each other, because part of what human females do is jockey for position in the female dominance hierarchy for the top position, which is the woman who gets to be most sexually selective. And so that drives female-female competition, and it's a different dynamic. There's similarities between female-female competition and male-male competition, but there are also differences, and they're pronounced. So men, for example, men are more likely to compete for socioeconomic status, and that's partly because that drives female mate choice. So the correlation for men between socioeconomic status and sexual success is about 0.6, and for women it's 0. 0. In fact, it's actually slightly negative. Yeah. So, and that's a huge difference between men and women.
But do you know the anthropologist Sarah Hrdy? Hrdy. And she's like my favorite feminist theorist, although as she would say, I'm a theorist who happens to be a feminist, but she studied primate behavior, and she looked at the women the females and not women, very carefully, and looked at chimpanzees and gazelles and so on, and found that the female, initially, like male primatologists would look and say, oh, the males are dominant and the females are so cooperative. She looked more carefully and saw the females weren't exactly cooperative. Like they would pass around their infant, their baby, whatever they were, and would find, and so the male primatologist would say, oh, they're they're so kind and caring. She found out that when it was not it was not hers, they would take like little tufts of hair that would come out, or they'd do something to the eyes, and the baby would like be injured. And she saw all this violence.
Especially
but it was
true when there's
covert.
status differentiation.
Yes.
So it's much more likely that'll happen when a higher status female is taking care of a lower status infant.
Exactly. And she said the great tragedy, well, not tragedy, she said the reality of our species. And in fact, the subtitle for her book is The Woman Who Never Evolved. We didn't evolve for niceness and cooperative. There's immense competition, and we can, according to her, it's indelibly, marked in our nature to compete for the dominant males.
Yes, no doubt about that.
And
that seems true cross-culturally as well. That does flatten out a little bit in the more egalitarian societies. Yeah. So instead of being exaggerated, it does flatten to some degree.
Right.
So you could imagine that there's a biological component and a cultural component.
Of course,
and
both.
In that case, if you modify the cultural component, then that seems to decrease the overall. So, let me be more clear about this. Women are less prone to mate up across and up status hierarchies in Scandinavia than they are in less egalitarian countries, but they're still prone to do it. So worldwide, for example, young women find men who are about 4 years older than them maximally attractive. And they tend to mate across and up status hierarchies. And so one of the consequences of that, for example, is that as women have entered the workforce, they've actually driven inequality, because rich women will only marry rich men as rich as them or richer, whereas rich men will marry women who are poorer than them, but women won't. And so what that means is it's another factor that's pooling wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people.
It's a sortative mating now, and you just find someone with your background. Whereas a doctor might have once married his secretary, he now marries another doctor.
Yeah.
Well, can I ask then, stepping a little bit back from primates as well, how does this selection work in the era of swiping right and left? What is your reaction to the way young people date today?
Oh, that's I was really hoping we'd get into that. I was really...
Well, you were very into the monkeys, so I didn't want to interrupt.
No. Well, I should close off the Scandinavian discussion just by pointing out, and this is something that the Scandinavians are really going to have to wrestle with, is that if you institute effective policies to promote equality of opportunity, which the Scandinavians have done, you're going to produce some equality, so like a 50-50 distribution of men and women in the workplace, but you're also going to exacerbate certain kinds of inequality, and you can't get out of that. So you cannot have equality of opportunity and equality of outcome together. They don't work together. And equality of outcome, the essential equality of outcome doctrine, which is often described with the code word equity, is that at every level of every occupation, the people have to be represented by the same number that they're represented in at the population. So if it's not 50-50 men and women in each occupation and in each strata at each occupation, then that's sort of prima facie evidence for discrimination and for systemic discrimination. It's like, nope, sorry, you have to factor in choice, and choice actually turns out to be a very important determinant. And as the society gets flatter and flatter, choice becomes a more and more important determinant. And so what that essentially means is that the most radical end of the left-wing political agenda is logically impossible, apart from the fact that it's impossible for a variety of other reasons.
And they should look at the data. I mean, it's just a cliche now of, in any group of activists, and they'll say, oh, well, we need, in order for women to achieve equality, we need government-funded daycare, and we need online. They have it in Sweden. Yeah. Sweden has fewer women in managerial levels. Yeah. American women are ahead. In fact, now they have quotas over there, so they need female CEOs and females on board.
But it hasn't made any difference.
They're bringing in American women because we're so much further ahead.
Yeah. So it's made no difference in the distribution of men and women lower in the hierarchy.
No, it's called the Nordic paradox. Yeah. And
okay, you guys are so wonky. I want to get back to
okay, so yes, that's good.
I think we all want to get back to data.
I want to get back to these monkeys.
I was thinking this morning about, I was talking to a variety of political types, and we were talking about
This morning?
Yeah.
In D.C.?
Hard to believe.
Who?
Hard to believe. No, I'm not telling you.
Okay.
A bunch of Republicans here, and
Oh.
I've been talking to Democrats as well, but it was mostly Republicans here. And we were talking about abortion. And I made a case that that's really not a very productive discussion, because you're talking about a problem way too late in the sequence of problems. So by the time the discussion starts to be about abortion, there's 50 problems that have already emerged that no one has addressed. And some of those problems are, the fundamental problem is how human beings should regulate their sexual behavior. And that's a big problem. And you think, well, and there's an interesting thing that's happening, because, you know, the people on the right would say, well, that's easy. It's like, don't sleep around and get married and have sex with your marital partner, and that'll solve the problem. So there's strictures on sexual behavior, and those would be the traditional ones. And what you see on the left is that there's this weird paradoxical demand, let's say, that people should be allowed to express their sexuality in any manner that they choose, whenever they want, but that sex is so dangerous that it has to be carefully regulated at every single stage of the interaction. And so you know that many state legislatures have now followed the example of university campuses and put it in affirmative consent legislation, so that every move you make towards physical intimacy has to be preceded by the instantiation of a verbal contract, essentially. It's like, well, can I take your hand? Yes. You actually, from what I understand, you actually have to say yes. Like, nodding is not sufficient. And so each stage has to be preceded by affirmative consent. And you know, which well, I won't say anything about, yeah, I will. It's absurd. It's absurd to assume that that's how human intimate relationships are supposed to proceed. And then you have complicated laws emerging that are part of that, for example, this is the case in California, as I understand it, is that you cannot give affirmative consent if you're intoxicated. Okay, so you think about that. It's like, well, what does that mean?
It means that, like, a lot of sex
is illegal.
Has been illegal for a long time,
yes.
Including
marital.
including,
Yes, that's what it seems to mean.
On my honeymoon, okay.
Well, that is.
I'm rethinking it.
It seems.
I'm rethinking it.
It seems to me. It seems to mean, it seems to me to mean the California legislation that if you have sex with your wife or husband and either of you is intoxicated, then you're either one of you or both is guilty of rape. That's what it looks like to me.
Actually, I was in a debate a few years ago at the University of Virginia Law School, and I turned to my debate partner and said, so if what you're saying is right, two people can rape one another.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And she said, yes. And I thought, oh, shit. I mean, how can that be?
Well, that's the question. Well, okay, so then I would say, well, it's interesting, because I think that a lot of this confusion has emerged fundamentally as a consequence of the birth control pill. So, you know, because you got to think situationally before you think ideologically or psychologically. It's like, it seems to me that the 20th century will be remembered for the hydrogen bomb, the transistor, and the birth control pill. And those are unbelievably radical technological innovations. And maybe
Internet came in.
Yeah, but
My Fair Lady. Just saying.
It's dependent on the transistor, you know, because it spawned all of that. So that's the big technological innovation that spawned all that. And of the three, I would say the birth control pill is probably the bigger hydrogen bomb. So, and because it changed the fundamental biological nature of women and men. And because it gave women, for the first time in biological history, the option of choosing their reproductive status.
Yeah.
And that's
we like that.
That's well, yes and no. Like, yes, we like it. But it's not something that's come without a tremendous it's come with tremendous complexity.
Tiger? A fellow Canadian. Have you been reading Lionel
No,
Tiger?
no, I haven't.
I think you'll find him interesting because he writes about that.
Well, and I'm not making a case for the abolition of the birth control pill by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm pointing at its complexity. And so, because one of the questions is, well, once you can regulate your reproductive function, what attitude should you have towards sex? And one answer might be, the more of it under the more varied circumstances, the better, because why not? And I would say that was actually part of the attitude that emerged in the aftermath of the birth control pill in the 1960s, right? And it was a reasonable response in some sense, because it's such a cataclysmic change that you don't know what it implies. Well, what's the consequence of that? Well, first of all, people aren't reliable enough to use birth control in an entirely reliable manner. So even though it can work at near 100% efficiency, you have to take it extraordinarily regularly and in a disciplined manner for that to work. And so there was still the problem of unwanted pregnancy, let's say. And then there was the problem of the proliferation of sexual epidemics, and that culminated in AIDS, which could have easily wiped all of us out, but didn't. But there's other sexual epidemics that could have had the same effect, but we've been fortunate enough to escape them. And then more recently, there's been this weird inversion, especially on the radical left, that points to the reemergence of something like a set of sexual taboos. Like I think the idea that sex is casual and that it's a form of entertainment I think it's an absolutely preposterous idea. I think that it's psychologically shallow beyond belief to hold that as a core proposition, because it forces you to, first of all, if it's repetitive sex with multiple partners, it forces you to treat people as if they're interchangeable. And I don't see how that's good for you psychologically or for the people that you're using interchangeably. It implies that you can divorce sexuality from play, from the desire for a relationship, from emotional fragility, from love, from family, from responsibility, all of those things that are part and parcel of everyone, and I don't think you can, and I don't think people's experience indicates that you can, and especially on the emotional front. And I think that's partly what's driving. And there's also a residual sense that there's something about sex that's fundamentally dangerous, and maybe it's dangerous emotionally and personally, and maybe it's dangerous socially and psychologically, which it most certainly is, because it's a powerful force. And the way the left is reacting to that is by insisting that all forms of sexual behavior are valid and that it's reasonable to manifest all of them, but that it's simultaneously so dangerous that absolutely every aspect of it has to be state regulated and in an increasingly draconian form. And so I think what needs to happen is that the left and the right have to get together and have a real discussion about what constitutes valid sexual morality. And that's the conversation you have to have way before you worry about solving the abortion debate, which is very divisive and very intractable.
Well, one of the things we talked about actually just last week on the podcast is this cover story in The Atlantic about the sexual recession amongst young people, that despite the advent of the birth control pill, abortion is going down.
But there's
less sex.
There's
everything
less
is going down.
Fewer hookups.
Have you looked into that? Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, if you raise the cost of something, you decrease its prevalence. And I think that it seems to be,
dangerous now to hook up.
Well,
happen.
I kind of think that it's also a reflection of the same thing that Bloomberg reported on just a few days ago. They said that across businesses, men are thinking, I'm not spending any time with a single woman that isn't, associated with me in some formal manner, like my wife. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to mentor young women. I'm not going to be in a room alone with them.
Because I could face career annihilation.
Absolutely, and instantly.
They're frightened of young women now.
But as Kate Julian said, that's part of it. But we can over-exaggerate the part. I mean, anxiety and depression is going up amongst both young men and young women. Suicide is going up. It's not just a, most people I think are not. We're talking about an elite demographic who is into the consent and political correctness and workplace. This is across the board, and it's global. It's happening even in Sweden.
It's really happening in Japan.
Yeah, and Japan, exactly. So
weird things are happening.
And that speaks to, and especially in Japan, they have people, especially young men, have given up on intimacy, and that having sex is actually I mean,
but have
too
they
much
given up
trouble.
on the sex robots?
Right.
No.
Well, right. Well,
The
that's
Hello
the
Kitty
question.
robots.
Well, and there's pornography.
Yeah,
There's
lots of
pornography. And
Like basically zero risk
But even
sexual
when
behavior.
you allow for pornography, that men and women will sort of separate that from their actual sex life. But anyway, we're seeing a whole, I guess, collapse of intimacy, let alone sex. And I don't think that's just explained by the political nature. So I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I don't know the literature on the decline in sexual activity well enough to know if it's valid or reliable. But I mean, I think that, you know, in a stable society, you take lots of things for granted. You take the fact that men and women are going to be sexually attracted to one another for granted. And even though it's more fragile than it appears, you know, it's suppressed more easily than you might think. And you take the idea that men and women are going to move together towards the establishment of long-term intimate relationships for granted. But that's partly because you don't understand what invisible preconditions exist to make that self-evident. You know, and when those invisible preconditions are disrupted by rapid technological or sociological change, then things shift underneath you and you don't know why. Like,
a lot of it is traced to the advent of the smartphone, especially in the Generation Z. That Kate was explaining this to us, that you could see it was broadband internet and the smartphone that led to this, you know, increasing fall off of relationships.
Yeah, well, maybe the abstract is more interesting than the proximal. You see
Kate,
that when you're having dinner with people.
I want to know the truth. Have you ever been with somebody you loved and found fascinating and all that, but you really wanted to get back to your smartphone? Has that ever happened?
Yeah, well, it happens all the time.
It happens to me.
Yeah,
She'll never admit it.
No, it happens during our podcast. To tell you to put your phone down.
No, I'm researching things for the purpose of the podcast.
They're very addictive.
Yeah, they're very addictive. And you know, I read the other day that
they're very alluring.
They are.
We're kind of going together.
The preferred method of interpersonal communication between young people now is texting rather than face-to-face communication.
Right, and the swiping that apes don't.
Well, that's a very interesting topic too. Like the Tinder phenomenon. That's because that's also a major technological revolution, because what it's done, I would say, for the first time, is reduce the cost of rejection to males to zero, because it hides it. The only people you ever hear from are people who haven't rejected you.
Although but there was one man who had to make 300. He actually tallied it.
Yeah.
He had to make 300 requests of swiping right or whatever for
to
one reply. So I think he had the sense of rejection.
Sure, but it's massively attenuated.
Yeah.
And it's not observed.
Yeah, you're not being humiliated.
Not at all. It's really at arm's length, and you know, you can swipe very, very rapidly, and so you can get all that rejection over with in a very short period of time.
Right, it's like losing a video game or something. You go on to the next.
Less. Because
worse. Not nearly as bad.
Yeah.
So, and you know, I don't know what. And I mean, Tinder also reduces one of the other things that you want to think about with regards to sex, and I think this is probably particularly true for women, is that to what degree is it in women's interests to allow the cost of sex to fall to zero? Because with pornography certainly does that. And it just seems to me that that's not a very good long-term strategy for relationships between men and women, because whatever sex is worth, the cost of zero is the wrong price. Mm-hmm. And so that's... You know, I've heard
you can go to the bunny ranch and pay quite a bit for it.
Well, true, but that's true. But you don't have to. And you know, I've heard from a number of women read blog reports on their frustration with their attempts to be relatively sexually selective. Like, let's say they decide that they're not going to sleep with their new partner on the first date. You know, they're frustrated by the fact that to the degree that they're being cautious in their sexual behavior, which I think is actually an admirable idea, that they're instantly outcompeted, especially if their partners are somewhat impulsive, by women who will say yes at the drop of a hat. And so, well, again, I don't think, you know, it depends on what the goal is. That's the thing, is that there's short-term sexual gratification, but the literature indicates that married couples, for example, or couples in a permanent long-term monogamous relationship are more sexually satisfied than single people. And maybe the single people have to be parsed out into those who are sexually successful and those who aren't. But I suspect that wouldn't make that much difference. But whatever. There's the utility of relatively immediate sexual gratification, for whatever that's worth, and the adventurousness that goes along with that, let's say. The hunt and the excitement of having a new partner and all of that. And maybe even the danger that's associated with that, because people like to have a little bit of danger in their life. But what's the goal? It's like, what do people want? And I mean, there's a great book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts that was written by Google engineers. And so it contains great psychology, because Google engineers don't care about political correctness, and they just write down what they find, and they don't even notice that it's politically incorrect. Hence James Damore, for example. And what they found was that women use pornography just as much as men, but the pornography that women use is verbal. It's not imagistic. And that the pornographic novels, essentially, follow the same extraordinarily standard plot line, to the degree that publishing houses like Harlequin, which
I was going to say it's the bodice rippers, the
that's
romance
right.
novels.
Yeah, right. So in the Harlequin series, you have the ones that were published like in the 1970s that are they're tame. There's a small bit of,
they're pretty hot, actually.
well, there's a variety. They range from completely tame to essentially to hardcore pornography. But the plots are quite similar, and the plot is young, relatively innocent woman finds powerful, interesting, dangerous male, tames him, and then they live happily ever after.
Love.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and it's the Beauty and the Beast plot, which is a fundamental.
Wasn't the biggest search for women on Pornhub we discovered? We did an episode on porn. Was for women it was rape? Wasn't that like the?
No, lesbianism. Or at least that was your porn. Yeah, that was your
That's
search.
not me.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
You know what my porn is? Going to the Williams-Sonoma store.
I know. It is female porn.
All those pots.
Oh, the pots and pans.
No,
but
but
Bill
Calm
Maher,
down,
the
calm down.
philosopher Bill Maher,
Yeah.
once said that men and women should never tell one another their fantasies, because women are outraged by what we say, and we're totally bored by what they say. And I thought, like, women have kind of these scenarios and, I don't know, unicorns. I don't know what they're doing. Storylines. And men, it's just like, I don't want to say this to you, but there's a lot of just close-ups of female body parts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, well, men are much more visually oriented and sexually.
But now they're being shamed. I mean, now it's called the male gaze. Mm-hmm. And so there's all of this like, oh my God, the Sports Illustrated is exploiting the female figure. I think, yeah, I mean, men like it. Mm-hmm. And I'm worried that now, sort of the way in the past sexual gays were shamed, we're now reversing it and shaming like heterosexual.
Yes, that's definitely happening.
Remember we had the young woman who complained about being whistled at, and I said, don't worry, it stops.
Yeah.
Do we have a little bit of time for a couple more topics with you? Because one of the things that is coming out of this younger generation, and you have a chapter of it in your book, which I don't...
Sorry, I wanted to finish the line that we were pursuing.
Oh, sorry.
I should do that.
Sorry.
Well, with sexual behavior, the question is, what's the end game? And this is what people have to ask themselves, is like, one of the corollaries to the female pornographic romance is actually the establishment of a long-term relationship. And the question is, it's so funny because I got pilloried in the New York Times for talking about enforced monogamy. It's quite interesting, because
that gets brought up like in every snarky interview.
Ridiculous. It was so ridiculous. I talked to that woman for two days.
I know, and it's just like a little side comment, and then that became like the
center,
the
showcase. Can you just explain, like enforced monogamy? You mean forced marriage, or?
No, I mean that it was an anthropological term, which she knew perfectly well, because she's a very smart person. And all it means is that there's a pronounced proclivity in human societies around the world to enforce monogamous relationships at multiple levels of the sociological hierarchy. You do it culturally, you do it in expectation, you do it legally. And enforced monogamy, so my son was just married, and if he came to me next year and he said, hey, Dad, guess what? I've managed to have 4 affairs in the last year with hot women, and my wife hasn't found out about any of them. I'm not going to pat him on the back and say, good job, kid. I'm going to say, what the hell's up with you? You violated the vow that you took. You're putting your whole future at risk. You're betraying yourself and your wife. And well, that's enforced monogamy. The idea is that the social norm is the establishment of a long-term monogamous relationship, and that there are strictures put in place to support that, but also to punish deviation from it. And you say, well, maybe not so much on the punishment end, but it depends. It's like, what do you want? What is it that you want? You want a long-term stable relationship or not? And if that's the goal, then your behavior should be devoted to whatever it is that facilitates that goal. And I certainly don't see that casual and impulsive sex fits that bill, not in the least. And all of the evidence with regards to living together shows that that's actually detrimental to the establishment of a long-term relationship. So first of all, common law marriage, people who are in a common law marriage are much more likely to be divorced. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, people who live together before they get married are much more likely to be divorced after they get married. So the idea that, well, you can try someone on for size and see how it works, and then you're going to see if you're compatible. It's like, that's one story. Another story is, well, how about you and I live together for a little while, and, you know, if you're not so bad, but maybe I can find someone better, and if I do, you know, in the next year and a half or so, because we're not hooked together in any formal way, I can just trade you in. It's okay, you can do the same to me. But I don't really see that as the sort of complementary mutual interaction that leads to the formulation of long-term trust. And I think it's a better story for interpreting what constitutes living together than, well, you know, we're going to try each other out because that's what mature people would do.
It's a lease or a rental.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Never wash the rental cars, Reagan used to say.
Yeah, well, that's it. But most importantly, the data indicate that it doesn't work. Is that you're more likely to get divorced, not less likely. Because maybe the right attitude is, well, you're probably about as flawed as me, and you know, we're lucky that we found each other, and so let's see if we can make a commitment because we're engaging in something that's very risky, you know, an intimate relationship, and we're going to commit to each other and see if we can build something of value across time. And there's a definite risk in that, but there's a compliment to your partner. It's like, well, I think you're worth making a sacrifice for. And what's the sacrifice? Well, it's everyone else. It's a big sacrifice. And if you don't see that as a compliment, then I don't think you're thinking, because